Stark County Long-Term Recovery Team was fortunate to have me for 6.5 years. Most of the members on our board were very long-term committee and board members. It makes a tremendous difference in your ability to recover if you have long-term board members that are on there. That disaster work is kind of different from a lot of other nonprofit work. We've already talked about the different language that there is, so just getting over that language barrier is a big part of it. But you're going to see, when you see these two interact, you're going to understand how Joplin was able to recover the way they did. Because they can just about finish each other's sentences. And that's the kind of relationship you really need to have on your board to enable you to really get your community fully recovered from a disaster. Go ahead, Steve.
Thank you. And we did not know each other before the disaster. Thank you, Chris. We didn't know each other.
We had never met. I heard her name, and that was it. And then we became attached at the hip after the disaster. Is our presentation in? Hold on. But pretty much, she kept me sane. I kept her sane, I think, most days. Some days we struggled at that, but not keeping each other sane, but keeping the community going. But, you know, I always say that one of the biggest blessings, you know, our tornado happened. It was devastating. We had horrible things that we had to listen to and hear, but one of the best things that came out of it are the relationships that we built. One of those being my friend Renee, and we still, once a month, and there's 4 of us that have a meal together, and that's continued because we're so connected for a lot of different reasons, and it's been a huge part of my growth as a person, and you know, it's been an amazing journey to walk with. I will tell you, and we're just going to kind of tag team this because, as we both have said, we really like to talk. So we'll just kind of hit on some different things. But whenever our long-term recovery committee started, first of all, Renee was at the meeting that appointed or decided who was going to be committee chairs. I wasn't. I got appointed without being there to the Unmet Needs Committee. Was very, very glad that that happened because I loved that committee. But we were both on the executive team early on of our long-term recovery committee, but not in the chair roles. We had a lot of stress and difficulty and growing pains in the first 6 to 9 months. It was a long journey. We had people in leadership roles who didn't really have the focus of our community at their forefront. And they had conflicts of interest, and they had lots of different things that we had to work through as a community. So know, even if you are going through some of that, it's a hard process to go through, and some people will continue and some people will move off. But that's all part of that growth and figuring everything out for your community. One of the things that both Renee and I, we both go around the United States now and talk about disaster recovery and things that worked well in Joplin, what didn't work. We're always very honest about problems, things that we wish we had done differently or wish we had known ahead of time. Our whole goal is to give you resources. We realize, and we were told over and over, disasters start and end locally. It's your disaster. You make the decisions about your community. And that's completely true. But we want to at least give you some information and guidance, and that maybe some of what we learned can benefit you. One thing that Renee said a lot in the 3 years of the hard work after our tornado was we had to shut out a lot of that noise. There was a lot of excess stuff. There are lots of excess, different groups coming in who wanted to help, who might have had really great meaning, but they just added to that noise. So you have to kind of get some sort of clarity of what is the best noise for us, what's not noise, what becomes assistance, and how do we move forward. So do you have anything else on that?
I would just say with that, our executive committee met. It wasn't necessarily restricted to just us, but we didn't advertise it. That was where we need to do business. And then our LTRC committee was where we had the public 75, 100 people sitting together. But our executive committee was really where, and that's, just understanding, because if you let everybody be on your agenda, you never get the work done. So our business meeting was somewhat that executive committee, and we were very protective of letting people be on that agenda.
And that executive committee was in our area, was all of the chairs of all of our subcommittees. So our unmet needs committee, our spiritual emotional committee, our volunteer, our construction, all of those different committees, that's how they made up our executive team. And it doesn't have to be that way, and I know in a lot of the communities that you have, where you have the judges have appointed those members, and that's great as well, as long as there's good communication from the executive team on down. All right, so session overview, just to kind of let you know what we're going to be talking about. A little bit about what causes disaster burnout and compassion fatigue. I will tell you a little funny story that whenever I was emailing out, I mentioned earlier I like resources, and I regularly would email out resources to members of our long-term recovery committee. And we had several hundred people who those emails would go out to. And I emailed out about, I don't know if you remember, about passion fatigue instead of compassion fatigue. And
she has 7 children. No, I'm just teasing.
and I got a lot of interesting emails about what exactly is passion fatigue. So we also have to laugh at ourselves. We also have to understand that it's okay that people will make fun of you. But we're going to talk, Renee's talked a little bit about that, but we'll talk about compassion fatigue, some signs of burnout, avoiding burnout before it starts, some of those needs of board and committee members. One of the things I like to do also is do a lot of training on how boards function. So we're going to talk a little bit about how can your board function as effectively as possible. What are the elements of a good meeting? How do you set boundaries? And then tips and techniques to care for yourself and your team. Renee's done some of that. She's going to touch on that a little bit more. And some best practices from Joplin and other disasters. Some things that we did and other communities have done that have worked well. So that's what we're going to be talking about. And I will also reiterate, we've already talked about...
Oh, wait, that's funny. Come on, you guys, you got to say that's funny.
These
Come
are
on.
all pictures from the
Come on.
Joplin tornado that myself or some other people took. So have water, need beer. So that was pretty humorous. I will say, to reiterate also what, I made my goal. I walked a lot, so that's good too. After our tornado, I, like Renee and like a lot of people, I just started working. And I did work a full-time job. Renee was the slacker who wasn't working during the summer and just volunteering. But I was working a full-time job. I had, at the time, a 2.5-year-old. My in-laws were visiting. I had a lot of these stresses that were just on me. But I thought, everything's great. I'm fine. I don't need anything extra. And my husband was like, you need some talking to. Something, because you're driving us all crazy. So it became my Zen appointments. I went to a counselor who just helped me realize, okay, there's a lot of stuff going on, and I'm internalizing a lot of it. So I just always like to say, don't be afraid to accept help and to realize it whenever you need it yourself. And all my staff knew, Stephanie's going for her Zen appointment. She needs to get out, and she's going to be better when she comes back. Okay, so I'm going to hand this over to Renee.
Oh, are you?
Aren't you doing this one?
What's the next? Oh, okay, yes. This is the second slide. Sorry. Okay, so we've talked a little bit at length, but I want to talk specifically then to your volunteers and to you guys, okay? Because you guys are probably the leaders in your community. That's why you got assigned this. You're well known. I have to say, both Stephanie and I were not known that much in our community. I think we were just the, willing participants at that point. But we now have some credibility in our community because of that. So just, you weren't assigned this by mistake, I just want to say. And so it is probably because you have been the worker bee. And do you guys know that the Japanese beaver is the hardest working animal in the animal kingdom? So we used to call ourselves the Japanese beavers because we felt like we were like, yeah. But okay, so you don't have to be that way, okay? No, there's a time and place for that, but also be willing to understand that we put on our own stress sometimes, okay? I am one of those people that demand that my weekends are free. So do you think I'm a little stressed out on a Friday afternoon because I didn't get all my to-do list done? Okay, that's self-imposed stress, okay? We talked about compassion. First of all, stress can also be a positive. Stress got you guys out of the crisis mode, out of the rescue mode, the relief mode. Now you're in recovery mode. So stress is there for a reason. Stress is what we know helps in times of war, in times of crisis, is stress. It's called, but we don't, it's high volume, high octane stress, and we can't sustain that longer than about 14 days. And so you just need to understand. The stress I want to talk about is really kind of self-imposed. The shoulds and the ought tos and the I would have and I could have and all those things. Compassion fatigue, I like that Carlene talked about up in Washington. They also had the Presbyterian disaster assistance people come in. We too had PDA come in. If you don't have a Presbyterian disaster person in your LTRC, find them. This is their gift, is to help with compassion fatigue. And they will do it for free. And they'll come in and they're lovely. We had Dr. James Kirk and he was the bomb diggity. So compassion fatigue is where you are so full of compassion that you can't even care about anybody else because you're full. You have too much stories already. You have gave and gave and gave. And there's a great adage out there that says you can't get you can't get water from a dry well. And so maybe I want you to hear that again since I buffed it up. You cannot get water from a dry well. If you have nothing left to give, your well is dry. It's okay to sit out. It is okay to replenish. And that is figuratively water, not just literal water. But you have to know when, and so what are those symptoms? What does it look like? I remember not so much after the tornado. Sorry. Was it going on? I remember, sorry.
She needs somebody to monitor her. That's the whole reason I'm here.
Yeah. I remember after the tornado getting frustrated that I got a phone call. Okay? And I don't mean one phone call, but it's like, I cannot believe. Okay? If you don't have anything left to give, then quit trying to give, right? When the rubber band is stretched like this, what's going to happen? It only gets to snap, right? Unless you bring it back in. And the way we are able to bring it back in is some of the techniques we'll talk about. So disaster workload, we had disaster case managers that reported they had over like 200 clients on their caseload. Okay, it's impossible. That's gonna give you, you can't win, right? You can't do anything well if you have that many people. And so that is going to be stressful. Survivor's guilt, we talked about that. And all of you guys probably have that. I hope you've maybe even identified it today, that just gut reaction. And maybe you say things like, oh, we were so lucky. It didn't happen to us. And then all of a sudden you feel bad because it's not about luck. Dealing with bureaucracies, my table back there that spoke very eloquently about the government, it can stress you out. It can stress you out. I can't tell you how many times Stephanie and I, like I said, we kept waiting for a phone number for the case management office, but we couldn't have it because they didn't want anybody to call. And I couldn't understand that because I'm in the helping profession that says, go help people. And so 9 months into it, we weren't going to give a phone number out. It didn't make sense to me. Conflicting needs. We've talked about that, and there are conflicting needs. And so, again, that was one of our conflicting needs. If we started too early, we could have messed up the disaster case management funding. We had a city that was decimated, and they were looking for money. And we had a school system that was decimated and a hospital that was decimated. So many conflicting needs. And then one of the things I would say that we all probably end up doing is wanting to save everybody at the same equal level. And we just may not be able to do that. Tomorrow, Stephanie will talk about how we prioritized and ranked who we helped in the LTRC. And so what we did was have a ranking. And so things like people with children, people that are disabled. Those were the people that we chose, and you guys do it yourselves, but we chose a priority system because we knew that an inch deep and a mile wide wasn't going to work, that we could do our best work by helping some people a great deal. And we ended up helping over, I think, financially 400 families of that 1,200. All right, so signs of burnout, here we go. You avoid things. Do you guys feel tight in your jaw ever? Or is that just me? Oh, okay. For me, that's a sign. When I speed, I love to drive. And like our biggest road in town is a 45 miles an hour road. And I know I'm stressed out when I'm about 66 miles an hour and really pissed off that people aren't getting out of my way. Anybody else relate? Okay, so I've learned some of this self-talk, and it's like, come on, Renee, get over yourself. Another thing that, judging harshly the people you serve, like I said, how dare they call? I mean, gosh. When I worked at the domestic violence shelter, we used to have a joke that the job was great if these people didn't live at the shelter. It's not a joke, it's a terrible thing. But we loved our jobs except for the clients. It's like, that's a terrible thing. I didn't joke that way, they did. No, I just tease it. Short-tempered, I remember just feeling everything felt like an elephant instead of a gnat. You know, in the world of problems, there are gnats, and then there are elephants. My first husband's dying, it was kind of an elephant. But I responded to even the gnats like everything was overwhelming. Oh my gosh, what are we gonna do? They canceled the meeting and didn't tell us. We gotta find a new place to meet. Oh my God, anybody else get that? So remember, there are gnat problems and then there are elephant problems. Engage, so if you're short-tempered, frustrate, everything gets a 10 on a scale of 1 to 10, that's called short-tempered. Physical symptoms, exhaustion, tense jaws, vague aches and pains, and for me, this was one that I didn't recognize, but brain fog. I am a voracious reader, and so the tornado happened in May. December was like 6-7 months later, and I get books for Christmas. I love to read books, love novels, blah, blah, blah. And that's when I realized I had this thing called brain fog. I would read a paragraph and go, huh? What? Huh? I could not retain anything in my head. It took me almost 2.5 years to be able to read just a leisurely novel. And that is called brain fog. Or just things like driving down the road and go, I don't even know where I'm at. Anybody else have brain fog yet? Yeah, okay. So that your body is telling you something. It's kind of trying to take a time out.
And I'll say we as a community had some difficulties on our long-term recovery and as the community as a whole of harshly judging the people you serve. We have an initiative that has come out basically that kind of blames the victim, blames the person who's affected. And that's been a real negative in our community that Renee and I have kind of fought against. But whenever people start to say, well, they have a cell phone, can't they go out and buy their own food? Well, maybe the cell phone is the only way that they're connecting with the outside world. Maybe that's the only way that they are letting their family members know that they're okay. That's the only mental health, playing solitaire on their phone is the only thing that calms them. But we had disaster case managers and others who were like, well, they went out, we saw
fingernails.
Yeah.
Did you see they had fake fingernails? If they can afford fake fingernails, you know what? I'm sorry, I interrupted.
Oh, yeah.
But you know what? A tornado does not discriminate against those that have and those that do not have. And so I believe our recovery and the gifts we give back don't discriminate. Mm-hmm. We're just here to help people. And it's not, yes, we need to do that whole thing, what's it called, due diligence. I know that about FEMA and all that. But the details, it takes more work to judge people than to give them the $50 that they need for a bus ticket. And so that judgmentalness will get in your system if you're not careful. And I think we guarded against that. And we just kind of kept saying, the work we're doing is not to judge. The work we're doing is to recover from a disaster.
And we had to reiterate that regularly in our long-term recovery committee, with our disaster case managers, that we're not here to judge. We're here to help somebody. They were affected by the disaster. We verified that they were affected by the disaster. We verified what their needs are, and we're here to support them. And if they take their family to Chick-fil-A for dinner, then they're taking their family to Chick-fil-A for dinner. It's not like they're spending $60 on a dinner. Hold on.
Just a comment to that about judging people. We were just mentioning, we have one particular area of our county in which they, how do you say it? They feel entitled to services, and entitlement in a weird way. Like, we have all these groups that are coming in that are wanting to, help do temporary repairs to their homes, and they're very upset that they're not getting granite countertops, or they're not getting crown molding, literally to the point where they're kicking out nonprofit groups out of this area, or they're trying to set up their own nonprofit so they can get grants to buy granite countertops for their homes. And so it's sometimes hard not to judge the people who are entitled, who feel entitled, because then we were saying sometimes that starts skewing your outlook on everyone in that area. So that's something that we struggle with. I'm sure it's not unique, but.
My comment is, it's okay to say no. Yeah, it's okay to say, it's okay to say, that is cool that you want granite tabletops or countertops, but you won't be getting it from us, the LTRC. Good luck, thank you, value you as a human being, good luck.
They're very vocal in the press, though.
Mm-hmm.
Our long-term recovery group is a really bad rap because of that. And they're very vocal and very organized.
And one of the things that you really need to do as a long-term recovery and the unmet needs, and one of the things we're going to talk about tomorrow, is have a really clear policies ahead of time of what you fund, what you don't, what's necessary, what's not. So whenever they say, I'm not getting granite countertops, you can counter that with, yeah. And the reality is, what we always say is there's a good 5% at least of population of people who are going to screw with the system or who are trying to get over on somebody. I mean, we had people who came to Joplin who didn't live in Joplin ever, who followed disasters and they tried to get assistance. So there's going to be that population. You just have to guard yourself and guard your community against believing that everybody is that way, because it will burn you out really quickly.
The way we handled that, we had a similar family, and so to tell them that we were building safe, secure homes, they wanted money for their curtain rods. And I told them the money that we could have allocated for their curtain rods, we were instead going to allocate to their neighbors' walls. And that kind of ended the conversation.
We had similar instances after Harvey, and especially neighbors sharing what they were getting from different organizations, and so agency shopping. And so we created a welcome letter for all clients to sign, and the case manager signs, that just kind of sets expectations of what the client can expect from us, what we expect from them, and just information about grant funding and how it changes constantly and how you shouldn't compare your story to someone else's story. And then the other issue with granite countertops, an approach that we've tried to do is say, well, you know what, this is to get you where you need to be for now, and the hope will be that in a few years you can purchase the type of countertops that make you feel like this is the perfect home for you.
Nice, thank you.
Right.
Yeah.
And something else this goes back to the importance of CAN, and we'll talk a little bit about this tomorrow, is that whenever you do have people who are trying to agency shop, if you're not one within the disaster case management system and you're working outside of that, long-term recovery committees really need to work within the disaster case management system, because they're vetting the clients. They're telling, they're the people who are seeing what's going on and are able to tell you if they have duplication of benefits and all these other things. But they're also all using CAN. If they're a federally funded disaster case management, at least in our area, they were required to use CAN, which is the Coordinated Action Network through the Red Cross. And that is where, while I don't love CAN, it has a lot of some issues. It's gotten a lot better than it used to be. But it is where that disaster case manager can see if they've gone to 6 other entities. And they can see, okay, you're already working with Catholic Charities, and they already have an open case on you. So, if you're wanting to change that, then we'll talk about that. But we can't have 3 disaster case management entities all working with you, because that, one, it thins out the resources, but it also causes some duplication. All right.
Okay, I think I'm done.
Okay.
Oh, is this me? No, this is you now.
So now I'm just going to really talk about what makes a board function effectively, and what are the needs of board and committee members, what are the elements of a good meeting, and how to set those boundaries. So I've been on a lot of boards. I've been director of organizations where I report to boards, so I've been on both sides of it, and I've gotten a lot of do's and don'ts. Some of the things that board members really need, and that if you aren't already doing these are all of the information that I'm going to be giving here. I think we've already got some of them on our website. We've also got some, I have a Dropbox folder that I can share all kinds of resources and best practices in individual forms, but having clear expectations. Whenever you ask for somebody to be on your board, and Renee and I both have had this happen, whether it be a board or a committee or whatever, and you say, oh, it's not really a lot of work. Oh, just come, and all we need you to do is come to these meetings. They're once a quarter, 1 hour, that's all you're going to have to be doing. And then they get there. The reality is, oh, you're actually going to have to financially contribute. You're actually going to be working on a regular basis. You're actually coming to meetings once a month, not really once a quarter. And we want you to be on 3 subcommittees. So be clear about what those expectations are. Tell them up front, here's what the commitment to be on this board looks like. And we're going to be as respectful of you and your time and everything as possible, but this is realistically what you can expect to be a part of this board. And if you're new and you're still developing that, that's okay. You can say, we're really new. We're figuring all of that as we go along, but expect to work, especially with disaster recovery. This isn't a 20-year-old organization that's already running effectively and that already has all of their policies and procedures and all of their funding and everything else, where you don't have to work as hard. Disaster recovery is a lot of work in a short amount of time. So be realistic with your board members.
We actually adopted a MOU for everybody to sign, a memorandum of understanding. One was for individual LTRC members, and a second one was for each organization that belonged to the LTRC. Those are on our website. They're probably on the DLT website as well. Those were really helpful in some of this establishment, not just at the decision-making level, but all members, and that was really to protect our clientele. An example real quick is we, living in the Midwest, a new for-profit entity has come around in the last 8 or 10 years, and that is Storm Shelter Builders. And so we had this lady coming to our meetings. There's 120 people at our meetings every week. And finally, I asked this lady kind of like, what's your deal? Well, she worked for the for-profit storm shelter place in town, and she was waiting for the list of addresses so that they could go sell their storm shelters. I'm like, no. I mean, you come out to the hallway with me. You got to talk. And I said, you signed an MOU, and it says nothing proprietary can happen in this meeting. So you cannot represent you cannot be here for proprietary reasons or for earning of anything. So again, just setting expectations, but also know who's in your audience when you have a big crowd, because there will be people that are there, we've talked about that already today, that might be there for self-interest or financial interest, and you got to protect that.
And our website that Renee was mentioning is jaspercountycoad.org, and we've got a lot of our resources on there. Bylaws, I think most of you already have bylaws for your long-term recovery group, but make sure that the bylaws are clear. Make sure that it's a good guide for your board so that they know how often we meet. What's the rules if somebody isn't coming? What kind of teeth do we have to ask somebody to step down or to tell them that you're no longer able to participate because you're not upholding your end of the bylaws or the expectations? Job descriptions. Have a job description for your board president, your secretary, your treasurer, your board member in general. These are helpful for you also because not only does it give that board member a clear expectation of what their role is, it also, whenever they're not fulfilling it, you're able to go to them and say, look, here's what we need you to do, and we need to work with you on making sure that we're fulfilling your expectations. But there's also the other side. You as a board have to provide for the expectations of that board member. And I'll talk about that here in a moment. You need to have a clear, unified purpose. This was one of the things that I think Renee and I and our board struggled with early on, is that unified purpose, because we had multiple entities who have been in disaster recovery in different manners and different levels, who all kind of came to the table, and they all had different conflicting focuses. And we, you know, Renee and I were volunteers, and there were a lot of us that on the committee that were volunteers. It was hard for us to really understand early on, well, why do all these people have these personal agendas or these agency agendas? And we had to really work hard to get a clear, unified purpose that we all communicated out to the public as one voice, and we made sure that we all signed on with that.
So an example, I'll just be, you're being very polite about saying this. So our first LTRC chairperson worked full-time for a national organization 60 miles away in disaster work. She drove over once a week for our meeting. She wasn't from our town. She was being paid by a national organization. That's what her work had always been. And so when she spoke in her name and she'd be quoted, it was usually under her national organization name. And so I think we did well because neither one of our paid employment really had anything to do with disaster work. We just were volunteers in our community. Does that make sense? So I got to tell you, that was a really hard 9 months when our chairperson wore 2 hats, or maybe even 3 hats. But she wore the hat of a national organization, she had big status in our area with that national organization, and then she wore the hat of trying to be our chairperson, and it was very blurry. She also, her agency was one of the 3 disaster case management grantees, so she not only was in a national organization, now she was going to have the funding and the responsibility of 1/3 of our disaster case management. It was not good for her to chair our LTRC. Is that okay if I'm that blunt? Okay. Okay.
And it is important for you to be able to have mechanisms in place that you can say, this isn't working for us. And it is your committee. Even though she was the chairperson and she was the head of our committee, the rest of our executive team came together and made that decision to ask her to step down. And it was the best thing that happened for our committee, because then we were able to fully move forward. So even though some of you are struggling and you're just now getting your committees really effectively moving forward, it was a solid 9 months before we were really moving forward. It was a solid 9 months before we were really at that fully functioning disaster case management. It took a while. But the other thing is, we were told, you know, FEMA told us, oh, it's going to be at least 5 years. And we're like, no, we're not going to, you know, we don't want this to be 5 years. At year 3, our 3rd anniversary, we had housed 100% of the 586 families who were in temporary housing units. So at year 3.5, our LTRC stepped down because we were pretty much back to our, not new normal, but back to what we were effectively functioning as a community. We were told by FEMA to expect 25% of our population would leave and not come back. We lost less than 2%. Most of those were individuals who didn't survive the tornado. And the numbers that come out of our tornado is 162 lives lost. One thing that Renee didn't mention is, yes, we had a lot of PTSD, we had a lot of abuse and neglect and that type of thing after the fact, and we had 18 suicides that were specifically connected to the disaster. So even though 162 people lost their lives on the day of, I always say we lost 180 residents because those were all directly related. So I don't know how I got off on that topic, but back to board and committee meetings. Accountability. You have to be accountable to one another. You have to, if you say you're going to be at a meeting, be at the meeting. If you are calling the meeting, have the meeting at the time that you say you're going to have it. Have the meeting within the time frame that you say you're going to have it. Everybody's time is really important, and especially during a disaster, whenever you have 16 other things that you are thinking about that you need to be working on, and if you've got all these other things that you're thinking about, and somebody's droning on and on and on, and I like to talk, but I still, even though I love to talk, if I'm having a meeting, I always have it to that amount of time or less, because I know that's what I want. I can't sit still long enough to be in a meeting, especially when it runs over. Have accurate information. One of the things that I think we did really well in Joplin was that we shared our information. We shared out every single time we had a meeting about how many people have been housed, how many new rental properties are coming online, how many people are needing our mental health counseling right now. All of that statistics helped our committees, all of our individuals who are on the long-term recovery group know where were we lacking, what were some gaps that we had, what do we need to be doing differently. So sharing out information. And we'll talk, it's on there in a moment. Good team members who participate. We also had a very well-meaning young gentleman who was on our committee who was chair of our construction committee early on. Really nice, sweet person. You just want to give him a hug because he's just this nice guy. He was not a go-getter. He did not want to really step on anybody's toes. He didn't want to get outside of the box. He didn't want to actually ask anybody to do anything. He was not who we needed to be heading our construction team. And we had to also kind of work around that because it was just so nice. But nice doesn't get the job done. So you need people who are going to be participating. You need people who are good team members who are willing to work, which also adds to burnout. It does add to burnout because you're doing so much work, which that's whenever it comes into listening to Renee and doing all the techniques that she suggests. Understanding the bigger picture and how the long-term recovery group fits within that. I think this was really important in our community as well because as you guys have, councils of governments, the COGs, you have the counties, you have all of these different entities, you have the Cajun Army, you have all of these different entities that kind of come together. And how does your long-term recovery group fit into that? Who do you report to? That was one of our biggest issues. Do we have any authority? Can we actually tell anybody to do anything?
I think we did a worst case scenario. I remember it was at Panera, a restaurant. We said, okay, if we have authority, this is our plan.
Yeah.
If we find out we have no authority, here's our plan. Because we really weren't sure. There was about 4 of us around the table, and we're scratching our head trying to figure out, okay, if we rule the world, here's what we're going to do. And this was about removing some people and prioritizing some things. And if we have authority, that's what we're going to do. If we find out we answer to a bigger something, and not just our COAD or our VOAD, but like government or regulatory, then we're going to have to temper some of this. But yeah, we had to figure that out. And A is correct. A is correct. We did have total authority.
And what we had authority over was our pot of money.
Yes.
We had authority over the money that came in and the groups working together who were all wanting to kind of participate and partner. We couldn't tell our city government what to do. We couldn't tell our schools what to do, but we were able to say, okay, with this disaster case management system and the funds that we've got, we are you always called it the funding of last resort for the disaster case management, and that's what we had authority over. And we had authority over the resources and the guidance and the workshops and those types of things and bringing people together. But we had conflicting information early on because we were told by some of the big groups nationally, oh, you guys do have authority. You have a lot more of authority than you think you do. Well, we realized it took us a while to figure out exactly where our niche was and how we fit in with the bigger community-wide focus. Celebrations of success. This, to me, was what kept me sane. Every single time we had our full LTRC, the 120 entities around we met in different churches and different things. Every single time that we came together as a large group, we celebrated. Jay St. Clair is one of the pastors in our community who he had a whole, I can still do it, it's this special
Nick, knock, knock, knock.
But it became kind of like what you do in our community. And whenever you'd see him, he's the happiest, most genuine person that you can ever meet. And he really got people excited and moving forward and feeling better. Because one of the worst things that can happen is if your community doesn't feel like you're moving forward. And if your team members don't feel like you're moving forward. And if you don't celebrate every little success, you get burned out. You get down. You get devastated even more. So every single time any new store reopened, We became the celebratingest most community in the world. There's we've called it the 4 C's. You know, there's the 4 C's of disaster recovery: cooperation, collaboration, communication, and coordination. We added celebration, the 5th C. So we said we are celebrators. And we would clap, and we would sing, and we would get excited. And every time a new business opened, we would be out there, and we would be cheerleading on those businesses. When the schools started back up, we lined the streets of the schools and cheering the teachers coming back. So every little thing that you can celebrate, and getting the word out in the media about every little thing that you can celebrate, helps your citizens know that you're moving forward. And it reduces the burnout that even your citizens feel. Because if they don't feel like there's anything positive going on, they don't feel like you're moving forward, they will leave. And you don't want that to happen.
So an example, even in the LTRC, I remember when we recognized and celebrated the success that no more cases of water were sitting on corners. And that was probably 9 months in, but it was like, have you guys noticed? There's no more cases of water. Whoop, whoop, we're moving. So it's the small thing. We had not rehoused anybody yet, but it's those little things that we just continue to celebrate. That the first aid people, all those people that come in to give the tetanus shots, we had lots of tents around the world, or around our community, around the world, with tetanus shots. When they finally left, when we finally closed all the pods, points of distributions, when we closed, we consolidated the pods and closed them. We celebrated that, and we actually organized that. We said there was too much free giving out in our community. Like a year and a half after our disaster, we still had 7 maybe points of distribution of clothes and all sorts of things, and so we went to them. The LTRC went to them. They weren't all partners with us, but we said, you know what, let's all do the right thing and let's close this down, and so we celebrated. Anyway, just examples. So it's not the big first housewarming, it's we have no more bottled water sitting around. Whoop, whoop. No more teddy bears to give out.
And whenever we housed the last and final family from our temporary housing units, that was a huge celebration. And we only had to legally remove 1 family out of 586. So we're really happy with that.
Yeah.
And then regular committee evaluation. I'm a really big believer that you have to self-evaluate, and you have to self-evaluate your boards. You have to self-evaluate your committees. And I've got a lot of tools on this, on asking board members, how do you think we're doing? How effective do you think we're doing? Are we communicating well? Are we gelling? Are we working well together? And if we're not, what are some ways that we can improve that? So making sure that you're regularly, you know, on something like this, maybe once a quarter, once every 6 months, something like that. And it's an anonymous form that you have them fill out, and then you all come back together and talk about it and say, hey, this is how you guys are feeling. How can we work together, and how can we make this a more effective board? How can we make ourselves better so that we're doing better for our citizens? Okay. Oops, yeah. Just a little bit about the elements of a good meeting, because I can't stand, like I said, I can't stand right now. I'm having to go to these meetings that are a waste of my time. I say they suck the life out of me. And that there's no reason to go to that. I can't stand meetings for meetings' sake. After the tornado, we did a lot of phone conferences as well. I worked for a disability organization, and I started a weekly disability resource call. And having it over the phone was great because nobody could physically get all in one place. Long-term recovery groups, you really have to kind of meet face-to-face. It works a little bit better. But sometimes your committees can meet by a conference call, or you can do some work by email. Whatever works best. As long as you're able to effectively get the work done, that's great. Now, there are some things like board meetings, you really don't want to do most of those by email because you do have certain sunshine laws and different things that you have to be thinking about. But there's a lot of work that you can get done. I like calendar invites. People who still use paper calendars, I don't understand. I don't get that, but I know there are some people out there that still do that. More power to you. I have to have everything on electronic. So I always send out calendar invitations to meetings with plenty of advance notice, making sure that they know, here's when it is, here's where it is. If the meeting changes, the location, make sure people are aware of that. Send out important information before the meeting to allow people time to review it. So if you're going to be talking about, the disaster case management system and what how you're going to be funding certain things, and you really need people to review some material beforehand, it's going to save a lot of time if you send that out ahead of time and ask them. Don't just send it out in an email and say, we're going to talk about that. Send it out in an email and say, I really need you to take 10 minutes to review this before the meeting, because you don't want them to come to the meeting, review it for 10 or 15 minutes, and then get started on the meeting. It's going to waste your time. Have an agenda and stick with it. Start on time and end on time, and have a timekeeper if possible to keep topics to a predetermined time limit. If you plan on spending 15 minutes on this topic and you end up spending 30 minutes, you're going to have to pull that time from someplace else because you still have to end on time. And if it really is important, because you're going to get people to burn out very quickly if you have meetings that are supposed to be an hour and they regularly last 2 or 3 hours. Have a designated secretary and send out meeting minutes within 3 days. I'll admit, I never do this. I try really hard, and I always have a secretary, but it's usually about a week, realistically, for me to get meeting minutes out. But if you can't, Renee's really good about typing up meeting minutes like immediately. I don't know how.
Well, I do it in the meeting. I'm a person that can type and listen, and so you type those during the meeting, find somebody that can do that, and then again, you may not have to micromanage and review everything. Let the minutes, this is not brain surgery. So if the minutes spelled somebody's name wrong, it's going to be okay? So as the chairperson, you don't necessarily have to micromanage the minutes. Let your secretary send those out. The next meeting, you can say, let's do a correction. But anyway, I think that's really valuable to get information out, especially if you have a to-do list. I used to always, I'm sorry, I'm talking too much. But when I would take minutes, I would also at the bottom have a to-do list and highlight, darken who's doing what by when. So not just summarize during this agenda item we talked, but down here then very much have a task. Half of the sheet would be task. Who's doing what when, and that you need to get out quickly so that a week later somebody says, oh, I totally forgot about that. Well, I just sent it to you and had your name on it, so anyway.
And then you can call them out on it whenever they don't do it.
Yeah. Talk to the hand. No.
Use the parking lot method to manage off-topic discussion. So if you do have somebody who likes to get off-topic a lot and they're causing you to get behind in different things, you can use the parking lot method, and that would be part of a ground rule that you would have already established. And the parking lot method is basically writing something on a whiteboard or something like that says, okay,
put it on
if we've got time later, we'll come back to this. But right now, that's not on our agenda. That's not part of what we're talking about right now. But we understand that it's important to you. We're going to put it on the parking lot, and if we've got time later, we'll come back to it. It really does help manage a lot of the time suck. Establishing ground rules as a team and sticking to them. This is really helpful. I've been in some meetings where you actually have that on the back of your name plate, if you have nameplates, or that are even printed up and on the wall in your meeting where you're regularly having meetings that are your ground rules. What do we as a committee do and what do we not do? I think here's some examples. These are some really good sample ground rules. Examples like no mobile devices used during meetings, unless you're taking notes on it. But if you say, oh, I'm taking notes on my tablet, and you're actually playing solitaire, that's kind of, not really a good practice because you're not engaged in what's going on. No sidebar conversations. This is in the meeting, but also in the public. This was something that can really destroy your team. If you've got people who are off on the side and they're, pardon my saying, but stirring the shit. They're causing issues. They're talking over here about what's going on, and they're not making improvements. They're not saying, how can we make this better? They're like, oh, can you believe what Renee did? Oh my gosh, I can't believe she did that. They're not addressing the situation. So none of those sidebar types of conversations, whether it's in the meeting and you're just distracting, or whether you're going off and you're really causing problems. Then that goes into speaking with one voice in the public. So whenever you're in the public, if it's a decision that your team has made and you voted on it and it has moved forward, even if you disagree with that decision, you're on that team. And it was voted on and it was approved. Then whenever you are out in the public, you need to support that. And if you can't support it and it's big enough that you can't support it and you are going to just go against it, you're going to have to step down. Because if You have to be supportive of whatever the whole team has decided. And if you go out in the community and counter what that team has said, then that team loses validity, they lose face in the community, and you become a problem. So that's something that you have to really make sure that as a team, you're projecting the same voice out in the community. Be respectful of other opinions and listen with an open mind. You know, you might disagree with somebody, but disagree with them respectfully. And listen with an open mind. If you come into a meeting and you've already made up your mind about something and you're not going to even listen to them, then that's a problem. At least listen to them, hear out what their perspective is, and then go from there. Show up on time and be prepared. So if you do have materials beforehand, review them, come on time, be prepared to meet, because if you come on regularly 5, 10, 15 minutes late, that pulls all of the committee members late, then they're getting home late to their family members, and then they are frustrated with you, and they're frustrated with the team, and they get burned out even quicker. Contribute to the meeting goals. If you go and you've got really good ideas but you never speak them, or if you go and you're just filling a seat, then that's not helpful. If you're not the right person on that team, accept that and say, you know, I'm not sure that I'm the right person for this team, and let them move forward with somebody else. But if you are the right person, speak up, use your voice, say, hey, this is what I think, and don't be afraid to do that, because they've chosen you for a reason. You're on that team for a reason, and show them what you have to offer. Think before speaking, stay on point, and be considerate of time constraints. Attack the problem and not the person, and follow up on action items. You know, like Renee said, having action items are a really, really good part of a meeting. And if you have something that you know you're going to be responsible for, complete that in a timely manner and report back out. Whether you're supposed to report out at the next meeting, whether you're supposed to send an email and say, okay, I talked to Renee about X, Y, and Z, and here's what they want to do. Whatever the case may be, make sure that you are reporting that out. And then boundaries. I won't spend a lot of time on this because we're almost out of time. But boundaries are really important to prevent burnout. Boundaries are also really important just on self-care. They're important to make sure that you are not overstepping. They're important to make sure that you don't have a lawsuit in the future. There's all kinds of reasons why boundaries are important. Board boundaries, it's important that if you have a conflict of interest is a good example, that you make sure that you bring that to the table ahead of time. You may still be able to be a member of that board, but you need to make sure that the other board members understand what that potential conflict of interest is. And if you do have a vote where you may have a conflict, you don't vote on that issue. You step out for that issue. Another part of board boundaries, whenever I was starting to work in Southeast Texas, they were talking to me a lot about, do we make the decisions on funding individual needs? That's not something that at the executive team level that you really want to know individual names of the case, of the survivors. You don't want to know family information. You don't want to be the person that's making that decision, because you don't want to be the person that somebody comes to and says, you didn't fund my home. The board boundaries, you should not be a part of that. That's the role of the disaster case manager. That's the role of the disaster case manager, to know all of that information and to report it out to the unmet needs team. And then the unmet needs team reports it out as needed up above. But it's not the role of that board member to make those individual decisions about individual person's needs. Same difference with committee boundaries. Client survivor boundaries and disaster case manager boundaries. This is where it's most important, I think, and it can get really fuzzy, because most people who go into disaster case management are typically social workers or lay social workers. If you've gone through school as a social worker, a lot of times you've been taught about the boundaries. But a lot of people are hired as lay social workers. They may just have a heart for it. They may really want to help people, but the line between helping and enabling gets really fuzzy. And that boundary can become an issue where you become personally involved in that person's whole life. And people want to help and they want to be involved in that person's life, but you have to have a professional boundary. You have to understand, this is my work here, and I'm not going to take you home and you're not going to live with me. And that happens a lot, especially with people in giving professions, especially with people who want help. You want to fix everything, and you can't fix everything, and you can't personally take on all of the problems in that family. And you can't, I worked with somebody who wanted to adopt somebody's children because she got so involved with the family and started fighting the family members for these kids because she felt like she could be a better parent. Another person wasn't a bad parent, they were just struggling with a lot of things. But she, as a disaster case manager, got too close and really couldn't separate out what was appropriate and what wasn't. So really being cautious about, all of those basic things that you should and shouldn't do is part of that as well, because it gets very emotional. All right, and lastly?
Okay, so some techniques. First, be your authentic self. Reveal who you are. Let people know how you're feeling. So what I did at 3 o'clock is kind of some of that, is letting yourself be vulnerable and letting people know where you're at so that they know that this thing called human being is our real walk, not human doing. So when you have hiccups, it's okay to let people know. That was a tough one. That was a hard one. I told you guys the story of the man who described his recovery from alcoholism. That carried me along for a lot of times. And I told my team about that because I was in a place of feeling like we were getting robotic. Ensure the team hears the success stories. Again, we did a lot. Instagram, I don't even think was around, but we used Facebook a lot. That was kind of 7 years ago. Facebook seemed to be big and new, and we were posting all the time on Facebook, doing lots of shout outs. Stay connected to the reason behind the work. So again, remember why we're doing the work we're doing, and it is for the Smith family and the Jones family and the Hernandez family and the whoever families. And remember those names have faces to them, and that's why we're doing the work. And so sometimes it's inconvenient to have a meeting the day after the 4th of July, but if we skip a week, what does that do to the families? So just remind people why we're doing it. And that's why I oftentimes would tell stories. We had meetings every Thursday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I don't know why we did 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It just started that way. And we never strayed from that for 2.5 years. Every single Tuesday at 2 o'clock or Thursday at 2 o'clock. And most of the time, part of the agenda would be a story of some kind. Encourage time away for those who are struggling. So if you see some of those signs of burnout, and a lot of people are going to have pride, all of us in the room have some sense of pride. They don't want to be the person that has to resign because they're screaming at the clients or whatever. So you can give them an opt-out. You can say, everybody gets 2 weeks a year to not come to meetings. So you don't have to come to meetings, but we also don't want you to interact with the client or whatever. Let them save face through this process. So appreciate efforts of your volunteers. I think this is where probably we did a really, 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 really good job. April is Volunteer Appreciation Month in the world. So you guys don't know that if you're just disaster workers. Maybe you do. But in April, I sent a thank you to all the executive members of our team. Every April, we had 3 Aprils. The first April, when we still had 120 people coming to our big meetings once a week, we celebrated them being volunteers. We talked about what it means. And you have a great saying about volunteers. They're not unpaid workers. They're
I can't think.
Yeah. Anyway, but to really just continue to have shout outs. One of the things we did, it just kind of came to us. The first people that demobilized out of Joplin happened 6 months after the tornado. No, it must have been 1.5 years. I know it was November. Was our AmeriCorps workers, and they ran our volunteer coordination center. They did all the grunt work. They were fabulous, and we knew they were all leaving, and we really had come. I mean, we were like kid sister and kid brothers to each other. And so we bought T-shirts and for the 12 of them, and then everybody had a permanent magic marker. And in our LTRC meeting that last time that they were there, we brought them up and we did the cheering, and then they threw on their white T-shirt, and we all sent them out with blessings on their T-shirts. And they were like some kind of Joplin recovery T-shirt. But those kind of recognitions, and we did that every time a big group demobilized from Joplin, we stood and shared and thanked them. And as Stephanie said before, we always had statistics too, like you may not remember, but you did help 700 families with this many hours. And I think those kind of things are hugely important. The use of media, most volunteers, most of your guys' people are humble. They're not going to call the radio station on themselves. They're not going to call the newspaper on themselves. So you need to be creative and thinking about that. Again, we had large exposure. We're about 2.5 hours from Kansas City. But the Kansas City reporter kind of got to know me and would call periodically. And I started calling her with stories. When that time frame is that we're no longer sexy, I would call her and give her ideas. And so the Christmas of Joplin, 2011, 7 months after our tornado, on Christmas Day, she did a full front page story about the faith-based communities in Joplin sharing buildings. And so, and am I running? Do I need to hurry up? Anyway, so our and I will say the wrong name, but our RLDS church, I know it's a new name, Church of Christ, opened their doors to the LDS church because the LDS church, the Latter-day Saints church, was demolished. Well, these two people have ideologies very disparate of each other, and they shared church. My own church, which is a Christian-based church, our Islamic temple was not hurt in the tornado, but somebody tried to torch it. And so the Episcopal church that I belong to, we would move our services so the people of the Islamic community could do their worshiping. So anyway, she did a whole great article about that. So go out and give shout outs to people. Call those reporters, remind them their stories, and we need to hear more good stories in the world, don't we? Oh, Lord. Okay. And that's all. I've already talked about the halt. I guess I didn't say everything then, did I? Because we had a couple other things. So 2 o'clock every Thursday, invariably, we had water, we had popsicles sometimes. It was a great relief to come in at 2 o'clock. It would be the same way with you guys in Texas. People love 2 o'clock in the afternoon because then they wouldn't go back to work either. But it's the hottest part of the day, ain't it? So we would scrounge and we'd have ice water. I remember having popsicles. We would scrounge around. The other thing, and maybe you've noticed this about Stephanie and I, but we'd be at the front door saying hey to everybody, okay? So you guys, even if you're an introvert, this is not a time to be an introvert. At 8 o'clock this morning, I was walking around introducing myself to some of you guys. Do that. Even if it's not in your nature, it's not really in my nature to be that, like, oh. But do that. Welcome everybody. Get a name. And you say, are you new to our LTRC? We're so glad you're here. Hey, Stephanie, can you sit with her? She's new. And does that make sense? Be the welcome wagon, y'all. And then again, pace yourself. It's not an easy fit form. It won't. You guys will figure it all out. And then just enjoy the journey, okay? There's no wrong answers unless you withhold food from people. Anyways. Okay. Are we done? Oh, excellent. Is it 5?